Thank you all for coming to our keynote speech this evening for Dr. Michael Arnzen's visit to Neumann University. We're very happy to have him. I'd like to give you a little taste of what you're about to experience. This is from the book jacket to Dr. Michael Arnzen's recent publication, The Gorlitz Omnibus, which collects work of his from the past 10 years or so, give or take. So here's what you have to look forward to this evening. Bored with sleeping? Read this book at night. Michael Arnzen's poems are absolutely terrifying. His writing makes me uncomfortable for all the right reasons. If you enjoy things that go bump in the night, Arnzen's poems might change your mind. Arnzen is disturbingly, madly brilliant, and I pray for those close to him. Ryan Meekum, the author of Zombie Haiku and Dawn of Zombie Haiku. Dr. Arnzen is a colleague of mine from graduate school way back from the University of Oregon, and he and I have fortunately been able to keep in touch. We've kept up a scholarly relationship as long as a friendship, and I'm very happy to have him here. And he has a really amazing ability to take very dense intellectual material and break it down so anyone can understand it. So you're all in for a treat. Dr. Michael Arnzen, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. This is going to be interesting. I appreciate the invitation to come to Neumann and to meet with all of you. I appreciate everything you guys are doing, and I apologize if this is going to horrify and ruin your day. The topic that I propose to discuss isn't horror poetry, but something I've been researching for several years for a book that I'm working on for Guide Dog Books, a subsidiary of a small press called Raw Dog Screaming Press. It should be out in a year or two, called The Popular Uncanny. And as you'll find out, I'm going to explain to you what my interests are in these areas, both popular culture and theories of the uncanny. And hopefully I'll be able to explain it in a simple, digestible way that would be interesting to you. Does anybody recognize the image on the screen there? And raise your hand so I can see you. Oh, wow, everybody. Oh, Dave? Is that, yeah. What is it? Shining? Yes, it's from The Shining, the twins. And if you know anything about the uncanny, you know that the Doppelganger or evil twins are an icon of the uncanny. And we're going to talk about those icons in a few minutes. But I just thought I would put that up there to creep you out while you sat there waiting for me to speak today. Because if you notice, every couple of minutes they look at each other and then look back at you. And the return of the gaze is another element of the uncanny that's of interest. Two quick things. I have a website. I keep a blog on this topic. So if you find yourself interested in this by the end of the day, you might want to drop by that website, gorlitz.com/uncanny. Or if you're a Twitter fiend, I started a hashtag for this whole weekend of weird, horrific festivities. So if you're on Twitter, go to #PopUncanny. Or if you want to say anything about today's lecture, go ahead and tweet and include that hashtag. I'd appreciate it. All right, are you ready? Well, good, I'm not. Let's talk about the popular uncanny. You probably recognize this gentleman, Bela Lugosi, Count Dracula, correct? A lot of people, when they hear the word the uncanny, or when they think about the horror genre, they often think about some of the most iconographic characters from that genre. This character comes from a book, Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is a classic of literature. Everybody should read it, whether you enjoy horror fiction or not. This image is from the first popular screen adaptation of the book. Nosferatu was technically the first adaptation of the novel, which was ripped off and pirated by Murnau, a German, in the 1920s, and created a classic work of German expressionism, which you're probably all familiar with, the fang-faced guy. Bela Lugosi's Dracula. I have a question about this. How did we get from this kind of image, this kind of fear, or icon of fear, to this? This is the central thesis that I want to discuss with you today. How did we get from the Golem to the Pillsbury Doughboy? How do we get from scary creatures, even in nature, not necessarily supernature, to the snuggle bear. What the heck has happened in our culture that we would even be interested in scary things to buy and sell in the marketplace, or to eat for breakfast, or to wash our clothes with, or to snuggle with? What on earth are we, what's happening in our society? How did this happen? How did this come to be? And now this short, simple, snappy answer is probably pretty obvious, that the commercial marketplace found something that was popular and just simply reproduced it, right? You take an image of a vampire, Count Dracula, you put it on a cereal box. If Dracula is popular, then people will buy it, right? Well, that's a very simple-minded explanation for consumer behavior. It doesn't just happen that if something's popular and you repackage it, that it will sell. The fact of the matter is that there is a psychology behind fear that ties into our response mechanisms to our environment. And when you have a fearful stimulus, you respond, do you not? Fight or flight is the common way of thinking about that in psychology, but there might be more than meets the eye to our behavioral response. So that's what I want to get into a little bit, if you don't mind. So let's look at how fear turned into fabric. Art is a way for us to process our emotions. And fear, obviously, is a very powerful, potent emotion. Lovecraft famously said fear is the most powerful emotion. And Lovecraft is a famous horror author responsible for a great number of, a great deal of influence on the genre as we know it today. But when I think of horror, I do think of art. I think of Dracula, a book, a film, an image, a painting, an acting. I think of all the art forms when I think of horror. I don't just think of horror stories. But I put up here a canonical sort of image of fear, a very well-recognized painting from the German Expressionist movement, Edvard Munch's The Scream. It's probably familiar to all of you, right? And I would just simply ask you, as sitting there, how does this painting work with fear? Go ahead and tell me. I'll repeat it so it gets on the recording. How does this piece of art process fear? How does it represent it? How does it help somebody who sees it process their fear? Anyone? Yeah, go ahead.
I would say not by the way it's painted, but by the color used to the bottom half of it. It's like depressing and dark.
Okay. What's your name?
Andrea.
Andrea said that the colors at the bottom make it progressively darker.
Yeah.
And that this is a way of processing fear? How so?
Personal experiences, like if you're going down a dark alley, for example, or going to still like, I don't know, something unknown.
Okay, good. She's pointing out how the darkness is associated with the unknown, and that we are afraid of dark alleys. And I think it's important, too, that you pointed out it was at the bottom. I once read an article by Barry Grant that said the difference between science fiction and horror, which are in the same speculative genre, is that science fiction always looks up to the sky with wonder, and horror always looks down at the grave with dread. And that's simply that's the difference. They're both interested in wondering about the unknown, but one is positive, one is negative. I bet you'll remember that too, because it's an easy way to think about this, and it's true. Horror is a form of wonder. So that is another element of this stuff, this art. We wonder about it. We're curious about the unknown. Horror tends to make us wish we weren't. Anyone else have a comment about the painting and how it processes fear? Go ahead.
Screaming is a reaction to fear. When someone would be in distress, that flight or fight instinct would kick in. And that flight instinct would include making a screaming noise.
Okay, good. Sean is saying that screaming is inherent to a fear response. And then when you have fight or flight, usually you're screaming while you're doing either one. Ah! Right? Very good. I didn't mean to scream over the microphone there. Maybe I'll do it more often now. All right, and one more comment about this? Anyone? Dr. Hamilton.
The lines at the bottom left corner, they're very angular. The ones everywhere else are very wavy and ambiguous. So,
okay.
and I'm not sure what that means.
Dr. Hamilton is pointing out the composition of lines, and that there's almost a collision between the sharp angular lines, the linear lines of the, what would that be, a boardwalk and a fence, and then on the other side of that boundary line are wavy lines from the sky, perhaps, and the water, I suppose, whatever it might be, the world, the universe, coming into collision, and that this ambiguity has to do with the fear too. You guys are good. You already know all this stuff. The hand is up in the back. Sorry, I missed you. What?
Well,
is that Jessica?
No, it's Julie.
Julie.
To add what Dr. Hamilton was saying, I perceive that when I think of fear in this painting is that he's frozen in his fear, whereas there's movement behind him. The rest of the world is still turning while he's frozen in fear and he screams.
Okay. Very good. So there's another kind of conflict there between motion and stillness. That is inherent to the uncanny, as you'll see in a second. All right, you guys are good. Well, when you have something that really speaks to us in our culture, a painting like that is so powerful that people go to the museum, they talk about it, they tell other people, you got to go see this painting, you got to go to the museum just to see that painting. Postcards get circulated around, sent around the world. It becomes popular. And I want everyone to remember that popular culture is always, always generated by the people. It is a populist culture. And it's easy to forget that, because especially when we get into what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, which is a critique of mass marketing culture. But for now, I just wanted to point out that this scream image is so potent that artists have been remaking it in a homage to Edvard Munch, either because it speaks to them or because they see a metaphor that they want to share with contemporary society. So on the left you have Bernard Praz doing, that's basically made out of junk art. He's reproduced the Scream painting using found objects, recycled objects, and one of them is the mask from Ghostface from the movie Scream, which is also directly pulled from the Edvard Munch painting. It's very cleverly done. And on the right, I don't know, it might be too blurry. This is one of those internet images you get. The Scream painted on fingernails, which I think of as folk art, personally. I wouldn't just say it's just someone doodling on their fingers in some crazy way, but folk art. Contrast that with mass culture. Our commercial world seizes on what it perceives to be popular in our culture and tries to bank on it, tries to draw profit from that popularity that it perceives, maybe in a small group, maybe among folk artists, and turns it into something else. So we get the Screaming Scream doll, where I think if you tickle its belly like Elmo, it goes, ah! That is crass commercialization of art. You get the inflatable Scream doll, which some of you might have seen last Halloween. This is a very popular reproduction of the Scream. And people like to punch it. I don't know, as if they were fighting their fear or something. The movie Home Alone is an iconic image, but I put that on there because I think of Hollywood film too as mass marketing, for the most part. And that sort of screaming gesture, as you can see by looking at them side by side, is directly lifted from the Scream. Oh no, I'm left alone. Oh my. I don't know where that voice came from, sorry. But I don't feel scared for him. I feel more worried about Joe Pesci and the other guy outside in the snow. I mean, they're freezing to death and he's not even paying attention. Okay, so anyway, sorry about that. But this is what happens when the mass media commercializes what is popular. The meanings get lost. And maybe you never thought of the Home Alone poster in that way. It gets really bad the longer it happens. On the left, you probably can't make that out very well, but I think this is really the penultimate mass marketing of art, turning the scream into an ice cube tray that creates skull-faced ice cubes. Now, Homer Simpson is just goofy because that's just so familiar to everyone that it's funny. Now, I would never argue that humor robs fear of its power, but I would argue that an ice cube tray does. And let me explain why. Because there is a thin line of difference between an ice cube tray and a cookie cutter. And there's a thin line of difference between a cookie cutter and a factory mold that just reproduces the identical image over and over and over again, cloning it. What happens in that process is that the artist becomes irrelevant. The vision of the creator becomes moot, and part of the humanity is lost. Art gets dehumanized in this process. But I wonder, does fear still remain strange in this, the more familiar it gets? Is the anxiety of the screen still buried alive in these products, these cookie cutter, mass-marketed reproductions of fearful art and structures of the uncanny? That's the central question I have, and I'm not sure I have the answer. It's just the question I wanted to raise with you today. Can you really be afraid of that image that's on the screen right now? That's from the film Scream, Wes Craven. The character is really just a slasher who happens to wear a mask that is a homage to Edward Munch's The Scream. Food for thought. You know, Jason wears a hockey mask. Is that scarier? Why did they choose to make that direct reference? Scream is an interesting movie because it's about horror. It's really about the horror genre in a very self-reflexive way. But I don't want to go there right now. I just wanted to raise this question. Have I left it up long enough for you to mull it over? All right, let's keep going. One answer to this is the theory of the uncanny. And I wanted to just kind of cover this a little bit with those of you who perhaps haven't heard of this before, but also to help you to understand my thinking about that question. So let's go over the theory. The word uncanny really comes back to a German term, unheimlich, which you might think of the Heimlich maneuver. You've probably heard of that before. The word Heimlich means familiar or home-like, and unheimlich, the opposite of it, literally means unhomelike. So the word uncanny is a word that we ascribe to art, objects, experiences, basically anything we want, that generates this feeling of being out of touch, dislocated, that we don't feel like we're anchored in our home world anymore. And, or we think the object, the cause, the trigger of our fear, our fight or flight reaction, could be from another world. It's just so alien to us, so foreign, so strange, that it's unhomelike. Okay? And another phrase that most people use that's synonymous with the uncanny is the strangely familiar. It's familiar, but it's weird. I don't quite, it's not quite right. You all probably have had this experience before, right? You've thought about it before. It's a feeling of being uneasy, unnerved, creeped out. It's different than being shocked, and I wanted to make sure I pointed that out. A lot of people think of horror as being, about reacting with fight or flight, but the uncanny is more about the uncertainty that you have when you're afraid. It's that initial feeling you might have where you're like, wait a minute, is that really an alien? Does he really have some kind of probe coming at me? Is he really going down there? Sorry. I hope you understand what I'm talking about, though, right? That kind of freeze of terror where you're uncertain. That is more of the uncanny response than just simply screaming and running or going, ah, and flailing. That's more shock, panic. Perhaps repulsion and horror rather than terror, which is what I think of when I think of the uncanny. Terror, okay? It can be just a swimmy kind of feeling. Oh, where am I? What kind of world is this? You know, loss of boundaries, or a topsy-turvy sensation where the world feels turned upside down. Been there? Are you there yet? I don't know if we'll go there today, but we'll see. A psychologist named Ernst Jentsch in 1906 started trying to theorize this in the realm of psychology. He wrote an article called On the Psychology of the Uncanny. And in his essay, he described it as being essentially an intellectual uncertainty, where the familiar comes into contact with the unfamiliar, or the old and the new collide in your mind, and your brain just intellectually freezes. It doesn't know how to rationally determine whether the experience is a safe one or one you should be afraid of. Just like I described a minute ago when I'm describing terror. What's interesting about this is I put a little picture there from Salvador Dali. I don't know if you can see it or not. If you keep looking at it long enough, that optical illusion of the painting will turn from probably being a man with a mustache to a pregnant woman with her hands out. Do you see it now? Or the reverse of that? That is intellectual uncertainty dramatized right there in your brain, the optical illusion. You're like, wait a minute, what is that? And the brain kind of switches back and forth, uncertain, until it makes a judgment and says, oh, it's a painting of a woman. The second that happens, the intellectual uncertainty is ended. You're certain it's a woman. Right? The uncanny is being suspended, caught in that feeling of suspense where you're not sure. It could be something that only lasts that long, or it could be a permanent psychotic state. All right? Are you finding this interesting? You never know when lecturing if you're boring someone to tears. I'd rather just scare you, but we can talk about this, right? Okay. Freud said, you know what, Jentsch, you don't know what you're talking about. It's not that you're intellectually uncertain. It's that you really do know why you're afraid, but you refuse to accept it. This is typical Freud. He's saying basically when you're experiencing the uncanny, you are engaging in psychological disavowal, essentially. That is, that your brain knows why you're creeped out, but refuses to accept it for psychological, emotional reasons. Our brains, according to Freud, and Freud is 100 years old, and maybe you don't, feel like he's right about anything. He was a sexist, Victorian age, intellectual, all sorts of assumptions about things. But I think his theory of the unconscious is still pretty convincing, which is that essentially our brains lie to us to protect our brains, to protect our psyches, that our imaginations are constantly fooling us and trying to make us feel safe, or trying to make sure that we remain civilized. Freud's theory of the unconscious is that we have an id, which is an animal side, the scary part of ourselves. And the horror genre has long been described as the genre which represents monsters from the id. Monsters from the id. So that the Dracula character is really a projection of our own desire to kind of feed off each other. And you do that when you're a baby. You physically milk your mother, You drink from your mother. Oops, I went into Freud land there. Right? But that's behind this. And so the idea of thinking this way, what? I drink from my mother? I'm like a parasite? I'm like a vampire on my own parents? Our brain does not compute to us, so we repress that. We hold it back. We say, no, not me. I never did that. I don't love my mother that way. I don't want to touch her. I don't even want to think about her breast. And that is the, the theory of repression, okay? For Freud, the unheimlich, that unhomely, home-like sensation, is a symptom of repression. That is, that it is a return of the repressed that we refuse to acknowledge, but we are sensing anyway. Did that make sense to you? That we're perceiving it, it's dawning. There's some kind of realization of something repressed that's dawning. It's coming like a hand out of a grave. It's coming out at us, but we refuse to accept it. In fact, we want to bury it again. We want to repress it all over again. And so a lot of horror stories, the entire narrative is about restoring repression, about taking the monster and killing it, or burying it all over again. That's the psychology of horror explained by Freud. Shall I go on? Another element of the uncanny for Freud is something that you can say is a confirmation of the surmounted. Now, this phrase might not mean a heck of a lot to you, unless you're a psychologist or whatever, but it's an interesting one. Yes, that is like a koala bear. Aw, snuggle again. Might be cute to you, scares the hell out of me, especially when its eyes move. The confirmation of the surmounted, the theory behind this is that, according to Freud, and again, you can take it or leave it, when we are children, when we're very young, we start to form belief systems. And almost universally, one of our belief systems is that the whole world is alive. That, you know, everything around us might as well be like our parents and our family members. And we might see a chair and think, oh, the chair has feelings just like me, because we don't know. We don't know any better. And we establish these kind of belief systems that are very primitive ones. They're based on like what tribes use with fetishes and things like that. And so Freud calls that a belief in the omnipotence of thought. That is, that we believe all things are creatures that have thoughts, that have the capacity to have intention. And so then, if you burn your hand on a stove as a child, you might think, oh, the stove bit me. It was after me. And that this, too, is evident in the icons and images and stories of the horror genre. Okay? They're like childish creatures. Not just creatures from the id, the repressed that's returning, but also our kind of infantile or very young, primitive thoughts about how the world operates. We grow up and we surmount those thoughts. We grow out of them. We realize, oh, the stove is not alive. The stove doesn't try to bite me. I was the one who stuck my hand on the stove or in the door or whatever. Okay? So when you have like creatures of the undead or possessed dolls in a horror story, it touches back to that childish belief system. And that is also in the realm of the uncanny. Okay? There's also a relatively new theory of the uncanny that is very popular right now among gamers, robot designers, people who study android science, and that is a theory that's called the Uncanny Valley. And this is an example of what that means, and I'll try to explain it in a nutshell. It's not really psychology per se, but it's related to robot and animation design. Maybe some of you have heard of this before, the Uncanny Valley? Is it popular enough that you guys have heard about it? The theory goes a little something like this. For robot designers, it's better to, and animators, it's better to create something like that bulbous shape on the left than it is this image on the right, which is taken from the Polar Express. That's supposedly Tom Hanks in an animatronic format. Have you seen that? Most people felt repulsed by the Polar Express. They're like, whoa, it's Tom Hanks, but it isn't. It's like, rah! I can't even stand to watch it. And the reasoning behind that is the theory of the Uncanny Valley, which says the more that we try to create a likeness that is human-like, the closer we get to humanity, the more repulsed we get by it. We don't like it more because it's more familiar to us. We like it less because it's just a little off. That's just a little off Tom Hanks, just enough to make us feel sick to our stomach or something. Maybe you just don't like Tom Hanks, and he always makes you sick to the stomach. But, Matsuhito Mori created this little chart that's replicated a lot online. If you want to learn more about this, you could go to that website I showed you at the beginning, gorlitz.com/uncanny. The Uncanny Valley is this dip, which really this sine wave is progress towards inventing something that's human-like a robot that is just like a human, right? And we like those things for a while, but the closer they get to being actually like a human, there's suddenly this dip where they remind us of a corpse. Because, you know, all a corpse or a sick person is just like my best friend, except a little different. Sallow, or purplish, mottled, whatever the corpse-like image might be. It's like a diseased human. Less than perfect. All right? And so it repulses us a little bit. And there have been cognitive science studies of this that claim that, you know, it's a defense mechanism on our part. When we are near something that's sick, we perceive it to be ill, we're repulsed by it. We instinctively withdraw from it. And this might explain, too, what's happening in design and the arts. Okay, hope I'm not putting you to sleep. I find this stuff fascinating. For one reason, I think there's always a danger when you try to make judgments or make art based on something that's a little bit different. Because difference, in my mind, is a good thing. Diversity is a good thing, not a bad thing. But theories of the uncanny and those that work in these fields tend to treat difference as an other, as a bad thing, as they demonize it. That they're horrifying, it's scary. So there's some danger in the ideology behind these ways of thinking. And not all artists and creators are conscious of them. But I want to stay focused on the popular side of this. What makes the uncanny so popular if it's so darn disturbing? So next I want to just quickly, and I know this will risk boring you, but I want you to think of examples of these on your own as I go through, which is really a litany, a list of the cookie cutters, the types of cookies that are cookie cutter stock icons or motifs of the uncanny. These will all be familiar to you, strangely familiar. Stories that invoke coincidences. Stories that invoke coincidences. I tried to repeat that identically so you would freak out a little bit. How coincidental. He just said that. Or did he? Those kind of stories. It was all the Matrix. We're all just batteries for the Matrix. These kind of stories. Deja vu is probably the #1 sensation that people would classify as uncanny. Do you know what deja vu is? Can somebody define it real quick? In French? That feeling that I've been here before. Well, why is that so scary? Because we assume time moves chronologically. So what, is there some sort of time travel going on? Did somebody switch my body back while I was asleep? What's happening? We have these kind of questions that come up. Similarly, synchronicity is a similar idea. It is actually two things being in the same place and time at the same time and place. Synchronically. Like, let's say two people were to walk into those doors behind you at the exact same time, wearing white hats. You'd go, whoa, the white hat people have arrived. You'd freak out a little bit. Uncanny. Or just goofy. There's a funny side to this. You can't forget that. Repetition of numbers, like, oh, I don't know, 666. More motifs. The litany will go on and on. The double is a category, I think. That is the Doppelganger, which is a German word for two walkers. Twins, in other words. Evil twins, or your alter ego. Do you have do you all have examples of these in your mind? Stories that involved evil twins? I don't just mean Freaky Friday, but there's a reason it's called Freaky Friday. Okay? Clones. And stories that invoke mirror worlds, reflections that move, you know, differently. You've seen all this stuff in the horror movies before, right? Or at least the commercials for the horror movies. The living dead. I'm exhausted already with these icons of the uncanny, my gosh. Automatons, robots, zombies, ghosts, dolls, wax figures, and the undead. Now, I don't want to glance over this too quickly because I hope you're noticing the connections to the uncanny, the unheimlich. That is, living and dead, that is an oxymoron. You cannot be alive and dead. And the word undead is a created word. I mean, you're either dead or alive, right? So is undead alive? No, it's different. It's uncanny. It's uncanny. Are there any comments or questions so far? Anybody want to have anything to say? I think there's more. The possessed. Being controlled by a demonic force, a remote, secret powers that are at work. These paranoid stories that we see a lot and are very popular. Characters who are in trance states, like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, if you're a classic film scholar. Sleepwalking. Yeah, I didn't murder the family, I was asleep. The devil made me do it. Those kind of stories. And epileptic fits. Sometimes, have you ever seen somebody have an epileptic seizure? It seems like they're possessed. And Freud talks about this sort of stuff. As I said before, there's a danger in demonizing otherness when it's related to disabilities or differences that are human and normal. But we treat them as abnormal, uncanny, often in our culture, in our stories, sadly. Oh, yeah, but wait, there's more. Possessed body parts. These are my favorite. I think these were Freud's favorite too, because when I say body part, you know what Freud was thinking. Supernatural body parts, the evil eyes. That is that like an eye, somebody looks at you and it curses you. Right? Those kind of stories. Or gazing portraits. Have you seen those Gothic movies where like there's eyes in the picture that jitter around and follow the person unbeknownst to them? That kind of stuff. It's an uncanny experience when you first see it. You're like, whoa, did those eyes move? And in fact, in his article on the uncanny, Freud has an entire section devoted to talking about both dolls and eyes. I mean, these are two big icons for the uncanny for Freud. And I'm not going to go too deep into the theory because I risk boring you. And I want to make sure we get to the interesting stuff, which is the popular side of all this. But we have to all agree that these are the icons of horror that we are just awash in. They're so familiar to you. Hands that play the piano. I hope there isn't one under that thing over there. That thing. Okay, enough of that. Let's get to the popular uncanny. The reason, or one of the reasons, that all of those icons, those motifs, those uncanny images and story structures and plots are familiar to you is not simply because you've dreamed about them when you were a child, but probably because you saw a cartoon about them when you were a child, or something like that. Your culture is a part of your brain. And so the mass marketing of art has become a part of our identity. The way we think about and structure fear and our fear response is in part due to mass culture. Did that argument make sense? It's hard to know. Okay, so let's look at some, this is the fun part I think, some case studies of the uncanny in popular culture. Just out of curiosity. I want you to look at some TV ads with me now and see if you can spot those icons and motifs that we just talked about. And perhaps we can discuss as a group an explanation for them if we might, or what makes them interesting. So this first one I want to look at is something that I would say is, hold on. it pretty much speaks for itself. It's a commercial that uses uncanniness.
Son, there is something I need to tell you. I'm not your father. I am your mother. I'm not your son.
I'm a marionette puppet. I'm a marionette puppet.
If you like unexpected turns, you should try Vivid and Blast.
Sugar-free chewing gum with a liquid surprise.
That is an audacious use of uncanny imagery. You have a literal representation of the unexpected father who's a mother who flashes his own or her own son her chest, and then he responds by tearing off his skin and saying, "I'm a marionette," twice. What the heck is going on there? How would you, what is going on? Yes, very good. It's just, it's right there. It's just trying to get your attention by being weird. And it's mixing together a bunch of weird icons of the uncanny simply to draw your curiosity. Because the uncanny is both attractive and repulsive. And it's easy to forget that and think it's all about horror or repulsion. It isn't. We are both attracted to and repulsed by these icons. We're curious about them because we're caught in that state of uncertainty about whether it's safe, whether it's fun, normal, or whether it's too weird to deal with. In my opinion, that commercial is too weird to deal with. It has no narrative logic except through the uncanny. But guess what? That's what television can do. Commercials can get away with not making sense because they're only 30 seconds long. They don't tell a lot of a story. There's a narrative there. This one is what? If you chew this gum, vivid dentation of gum, that, you know, something magical might happen. You might have an uncanny response to it. It's so good, it has supernatural powers almost. That's all, I mean, I think that's all there is to it. I don't know. Anything else? Anyone wanted to say? If there wasn't a spokesperson there at the end who said, yes, buy Vivid gum, or whatever the heck he said, then it would be totally absurd and mind-blowing, and you would say, whoa, did I just see that on TV? What station is this? It had to have a little bit of normalcy. It made fun of it, but it had to have it, because the uncanny is always about both of the normal and the abnormal. Let's watch another one. This is a little more recent, and I love it. It's Mike's Hard Lemonade. It's actually called The House Deer. You might have seen this one on TV recently.
There you go. Nice. It's different. Sometimes you got to change things up. Who is it? Seriously, who is it?
Mike's Hard Lemonade. Always different, always refreshing.
I'm glad you're laughing. That's what I think Mike's Hard Lemonade wants you to do. Can anyone maybe share how they see the uncanny in that and maybe how it's used? Any thoughts about that? This is going to stump you? Really? Go ahead.
You said something about an animated appendage.
All right.
Separated here, like the head is conversing with the body. It's too bizarre.
Yeah, you have a dismembered head talking, the deer trophy. You have a standing deer that rang the doorbell without a head. So it's like a possessed body, but it's also a fragmented body. Is your hand up back there? I'm sorry.
Well, that's what I was going to add, that it's supposed to be dead. You think that something tiny on your wall is no longer alive, and yet it's talking to you and knocking on your door.
Yeah, drink Mike's Hard Lemonade. The living dead will come to your doorstep. Makes no sense. Why would people buy that? That demonic elixir. Well, there's a couple things in there that I noted, but of course I've studied it longer. Do you want to watch it again? Sure. All right. It's only a couple seconds long. Well, I'm sorry to inflict this on you again. I think Dr. Hamilton was the only one who said, sure.
Sorry.
There you go. Nice. It's different. Sometimes you gotta change things up. Who is it?
See, he's caught in a state of uncertainty, isn't he? He doesn't know how to respond. Am I imagining this?
Who is it? Mike's Hard Lemonade. Always different, always refreshing.
Always different. If something is always true, then it is not different. It is always the case.
What do you make of the side of the deer's body with beating, I guess, heart? What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, you have, the question was, what do you make of the deer's beating heart? It's more like a breathing. Yes, it's disturbing. It's like the telltale heart or something. You know, it's a decapitated deer who's able to breathe. But just seeing the fur move like that is very creepy. It's very visceral. You know, it could have just stood there. But if it just stood there, then you would think, oh, it's a stuffed deer. This is taxidermy. Instead, it breathes. I keep saying that weirdly. Breathe. Yeah, but that's how it is. It's weirdly done. Yes?
I think it's interesting that he doesn't seem to be freaked out by the talking head. It's
Yeah.
just the body and the doorstep.
Ah, very good. Yeah. It's like the talking deer in his living room. That's normal. We didn't expect the body to come, though, to join the party that they're throwing. Good insight. You know, a lot of theories of the uncanny look at this idea of the domestic space, the familiar home, versus the outside world. What's outside your front door. And what's interesting about this to me is also that it's structured in a narrative structure almost of a knock-knock joke. Freud also talks about humor in a way that is very similar to the way he talked about the uncanny in his theories. So if you're interested in that, you might want to go research it. For Freud, the laughter when you laugh at a joke, you're releasing some kind of pent-up, repressed emotions. And the joke makes it okay to let it out and go, plah, and have this physical, visceral response. And as a horror author, I often say this, because people always ask me, why do you really think that stuff is funny? Because a lot of my horror fiction is kind of jokey, and you know, I don't think death is funny. But dead bodies make funny poses and faces, that is true. But instead, I think that I answer that question by saying, there's almost no difference between a gag that's a joke and a gag that's a gag. Gag. Same thing. Visceral, physical response to something that's unsettling. And so that's how I think of those things. And so to have the shape of a knock-knock joke is really interesting. One other thing I want to say about this, and I want to call on some hands that went up. Mike's Hard Lemonade has like 4 or 5 of these commercials where somebody's at the door. Everything is the same. He goes, what are you drinking? Mike's. Oh, that's different. Ding dong. The uncanny arrives the second he says, that's different. So the commercial messaging is all predicated on a structure of the uncanny. And in other ones, it's like a 30-foot woman is at the door, and a scarecrow is at the door. Okay, Jim? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a kind of observation about both of them is that the guy's reaction normalizes the uncanny in the sense that he's confused, but he accepts the absurdity of it, or even the horror of it, partly because he has his Mike's Lemonade, I think.
Yeah.
And with the gum guy, the announcer normalizes the experience by telling you that you need the gum. He gets flattened by a giant fish, but still, in both cases, instead of the uncanny being horrifying, the product they're selling makes it acceptable.
Very good. He's talking about the normalization factor of all this. That in the Mike's Hard Lemonade commercial, there's somebody standing at the door who responds in a kind of normal way. Very, very perceptive. It makes the strangeness familiar enough. And I mean, I'm going to keep going here, but I think that idea of the strangely familiar really needs to be underlined. Because in advertising, they want those, the manufacturers of these products, they want their brand to be familiar to you. But they don't want you to think it's going to be the same old thing every time you buy it. They want you to think it's, different this time. And that every time you buy it, it will be magically new, even though it's the same old crap you've been buying. That is the logic of the uncanny in the marketplace. And that's why we have this weirdness. Let's go to another one. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Has there been any critique of the house gear commercial?
Has there been any critique? Just one, mine, online. I wrote about it a little bit.
Or any censorship of it?
Censorship?
Decapitated deer?
I'm not aware of that. I'm not aware if there's any censorship about the kind of brutality of the ad. It's pretty gory to a degree. I've seen worse, but yeah. No, I mean, I thought you were going to suggest that maybe to critique that ad, there's something very interesting there, and I almost forgot to say it before I went to the next one. Did you notice the women in that ad? All you see are their legs, just like the deer, as if they were trophies for the men who drink Mike's Hard Lemonade. Dun, dun, dun. All right, let's, sorry about that. Let's watch this.
Killer boots. One more reason to love DSW. Designer shoes, warehouse prices.
I love that ad. It's boots kicking booty, I think it said. And it's obviously a homage to art, just like the versions of the Scream we looked at earlier, except the art in question is martial arts cinema. It happens in a, like a warehouse garage type of thing, and it's got all the trappings of a martial arts battle scene. Without honor or humility. But it's clearly uncanny because A, you have almost what are ambulatory limbs. They're boots, but they might as well be legs or shoes. I'm sorry, or feet. Legs or feet. Kicking other legs and feet, which strangely removes the human element altogether. Secondly about this is, I don't know if you noticed at the very end there were a number of boots and shoes that were put into boxes, and you get the whole logo about designer shoes and such, but the voiceover said, killer shoes at designer. To me, this is like putting bodies in a coffin. And that's really what we saw there, were bodies being put into a coffin. So there are allusions to death and dismemberment in this happy little ad. And because it's fun to watch and it's funny. But are you laughing because it's tweaking that sense of the death and disease fear that you have as a human being? And then the other part of it too, I should mention real quick, is the voices. Hi-ya! The cartoony voices. Cartoons are inherently uncanny because they're animated. They're just still pictures, like dead bodies, that move, like zombies, except they're celluloid. Here we have something similar going on with the stop motion animation of the commercial. That still objects, shoes, things we see in our closet flopping down, are suddenly come to life, magically. So there's a theorist, a Marxist critic named Raymond Williams, who talks about advertising as being a magic show, and that magic is what we're sold, the magic properties of commodities. We're always sold that by marketers and advertisers. And the uncanny, these allusions to death, disease, uncertainty, and our fears, they're all in the same mix. There's something magical about the commodities that are being advertised here, as much as we are responding to them with a sense of weirdness, like, wait a minute, what's going on here? So as I said earlier, they're trying to brand themselves so that they seem familiar brands. Will go, oh, I remember those shoes. I remember that gum. I remember that lemonade. Hard lemonade. That's that weird thing. It jumped out at us, almost as if on its own accord, like the living dead. Yes?
I don't know if that, the image at the end when the shoes and the boots go back in the boxes represents the coffin.
Okay.
I'm talking about dress of gear. How do you perceive that?
The comment was, if you couldn't hear, she didn't quite agree that the boots being shoved into the box at the end there was similar to a coffin. And she was curious if anyone else felt that way.
Anybody else think about that? One image that way? Is that pattern?
I don't think they're really dead because they were never really alive, so.
Oh.
What's that?
She said she didn't think they were really dead because they were never really alive. That's an interesting logic. I agree with you.
I think maybe men throw the boxes away, but maybe women don't. And those combat boots or whatever they are.
Yeah.
They go in their right place.
Interesting.
All
right.
They have like gender.
Perhaps this is gendered. Oh yeah, I do think this is definitely gendered. I mean, it's female all the way. But the one point I might argue with you, I mean, you could be right. Maybe I'm just reading this away because I'm a male. But those shoes are dead because they're made of leather, which was an animal once upon a time. So you might love it, and it might mean something special to you, but there is death involved in the commodification of clothing. We conveniently forget this. The uncanny is when we sort of remember. So I'm not saying you're wrong, but whenever we attach a magical property to a commodity, it's called commodity fetishism in some circles, where we treat it as if it were almost supernatural, alive on its own, and it meant something more than it is. Yeah?
Well, Dad, there are killer boots, which we saw in action killing, and then they're put away in their little boxes. Another way to imagine it is, the weapon going back in its case.
Oh.
For use later.
The weapon going, that's macho. The weapon being put back in its place. Oh yeah, I could see that too. I would even suggest that the allusion to martial arts cinema may be reminiscent of some geopolitics related to this stuff. A couple of hands are going up. You guys love this ad. I can't believe it. I said, well, yeah.
It was the one alpha boot, took care of all the others and he put them away, put them all back in their boxes.
The alpha boot put all the betas back in their boxes. Yeah, got rid of them so we can go shopping again. Sorry. Yeah.
It's almost oxymoronic in a way. A animated inanimate object killing another inanimate object. I think that can be pushed into the realm of paradox. If something was never allowed to begin with, how can it kill something that was never meant to begin with?
Yeah, okay. The comment is that something that is fantastically imbued with life represented killing other fantasy creatures, that none of this is real, so it doesn't really feel creepy. So like when robots attack each other, that doesn't creep you out in the movies or anything. I don't know. All these things are just representations that could mean anything to any viewer, but the advertisers are sure hoping you'll at least remember them and perhaps forget some other things. Remember what I said before about how art processes fears and desires that we wish we didn't have. And so that might be lurking underneath this. Otherwise, these ads wouldn't be successful. So there might be some truths here that you don't necessarily want to acknowledge. I'm not saying I would even know what those are. But if any of this feels uncanny to you, that might be behind it, if you buy into this theory. Maybe. I love this one. I have to show you this one. To me, this is the best advertisement for the Uncanny.
Well, I've got 2 glasses of Sunfizz coming right up. Sunfizz, that's our favorite! That's because there's a delicious ray of sunshine in every drop. Come on, guys. I'm filled with nature's goodness. Hey, what's with you people? I've got vitamins and minerals.
Trust your gut, not some cartoon character.
That has got to be the best ad ever made because it's the most honest ad I've ever seen in my life. It treats the commodity fetish, the uncanny object, the sun, the logo, that comes alive and starts talking to people as if it were something straight out of a horror film. That is the popular uncanny embodied right there. And it's funny. It's hilarious. But there's something really true to that. And why don't people freak out in these ads when they interact with the Michelin Man or whatever? You know, the Energizer Bunny comes rolling along. You know, that's kind of strange. It's been alive now for longer than I've been alive, I think. And it keeps going and going. That is creepy. That is like Jesus power. Any comments on that one? It's so self-evident how uncanny that is that I don't even want to talk about it unless you have something to say. Dr. Hamilton.
This is, ever since you started talking, this is rattling around my head, so I want to save this for the end, but what that suggests to me is that advertisers are very aware of everything that you are talking about right now, and in fact are fine-tuning it in each passing year to use the uncanny to sell us stuff more effectively.
Yeah.
And again, you can either talk about this now or later.
Well, let's talk about it. Dr. Hamilton's raising the question, are marketers and advertisers aware of these theories of the uncanny, these responses that we have, these kind of private, hidden, yet revealed responses to stimuli that allude to death and all this other stuff?
And that, both of those, the ones you just showed, the one with the decapitated deer, it's like they're walking right out of your notes here, basically. It's embodying, in fact, the things that you're talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd like to think so, but you know, marketing is very strange science in itself. It's like alchemy. They do market research and they base their conclusions on past behavior and guess about future behavior. And it's almost like reading the weather, the Frankenstorm to come. That there's something almost like a magic act about it. And they're lucky if they succeed, but once they succeed, they keep doing it. The structure of the uncanny is that strange familiarity, and when you repeat things over and over again, like the cookie cutter or the ice cube, they become so familiar, they start to lose meaning. So advertisers and marketers, they might not be aware of what Freud said, but they do know that they need to estrange their own products so that we will want them, even though they're selling us the same thing over and over and over again. They want to keep their brand, which is a dead thing, it does not exist, it's a symbol, alive. They want to keep their brand, which I think of as burnt flesh, alive. Weird. This stuff is weird. And we buy into it all the time. Let's see, do I have another one? Are you tired of this? Is it time to go? I don't know. I think we need to end in about 5 minutes. I'm going to skip one. Sorry. You can look that up on your own. Here's a funny one. M&M's.
What are you doing?
What?
You're eating M&M's.
Yeah, so are you.
I'm not an M&M. Eat your own kind is unnatural. Crispy. Give me the bags. Oh, it's just disturbing.
You're right. right. It is like it's taken out of Freud's playbook. They're saying things like, that's disturbing, that's unnatural. Yet they are the ones that created this ad. And what's clearly uncanny there is the motif or icon of a piece of candy talking, winking, moving, eating. And the notion of auto-cannibalism is disturbing, of course. But what else is going on in this? What is all this weirdness really hiding, even though it's right in front of us? This is happening in a storefront. You don't even see the shopkeeper. You just see a consumer who comes in and, like a parent, says, give me that. I'm going to take that away from you now. And that puts the consumer in a superior position if you identify with the man, Putty from Seinfeld, in the ad. We're asked to identify with him with his superior knowledge. You don't eat your own kind. That's morally wrong. And in an interesting way, M&M's themselves, as a brand, creates a superiority for themselves in the marketplace by saying, we're smarter than the other brands that have the Michelin Man telling you to ride on tires even though he's made of tires. Or the Pillsbury Doughboy, who's saying, yeah, put people like me in the oven. That is freaky. You know, that's Holocaust freaky. And yet, we buy it. Yeah.
I think that the M&M ad is also saying, we're so good, you can't resist us, even if you think it is.
That's right. You can't resist eating these M&Ms. You can't resist us. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, I mean, this is a really fascinating kind of weird genre of advertisements that are aware of their own strangeness and just own up to it. Is there anything dangerous about that? I don't know. I don't know. I guess I would start moving us towards the end of this by suggesting that it can be dangerous when we don't pay attention to what advertisers are doing. Like if M&Ms were like thalidomide, well, sure, let's eat ourselves. Let's eat them. And there is a sense in which when we consume empty calories that we are doing something unhealthy and dangerous to our bodies. But let's indulge ourselves, like the M&Ms, like children. So I wonder, are we really being asked to identify with the superior consumer, the parent figure, or are we asked to indulge ourselves like the M&Ms rolling around on the floor like infants throwing the candy in their mouths without even thinking about any implications, let alone moral implications? Eating is pleasure in itself. Yeah. Or both. Yeah. The authority figure wins.
He wins, but he's got this stuff that he can't stop.
Yeah, he's throwing the M&Ms in his mouth the whole time. That is evil. He's saying, no, you don't get any, I get them, and I'm going to eat you. There's almost what you might think of as a colonialist ethic there, that I deserve it, that I should have it, and you should. Give me. What do they want? Your money. All right, I think this is the last one. Maybe it'll speak for itself. This is an ad using
I'm Orville Redenbacher.
Orville Redenbacher after he died.
Get lighter every day. Would you believe this little baby holds 30 gigs? But if you want light and fluffy, you've got to try my famous gourmet popping corn. Mine pops up lighter and fluffier than ordinary popcorn. See the old maids? Nearly 100% pop. You'll like it better. For my name isn't Orville Redenbacher.
Now that one isn't very entertaining, but if you're familiar with Orville Redenbacher from, I don't know, the 80s and 90s, maybe the early 21st century, this might disturb you because it's a computer-generated reincarnation of Orville Redenbacher after he died. And they wouldn't let go of their own spokesman. So they reincarnated him using a computer. And this one, I think, is evidence of the Uncanny Valley that I was talking about before. Because if you scrutinize it, it's hard to see on a projected image like that, but it's almost that Tom Hanks creepiness. And to realize that that guy died a year before this was made is really disturbing. Like, they don't care. They're just going to keep running with it. As if the human spokesperson and the animated spokesperson, like an M&M, like a Pillsbury Doughboy, whatever, that they are the same, that humanity no longer matters. At the beginning of this lecture, I talked about how art and the creator no longer matter once you mass produce art. It starts out with good intentions, it becomes popularized, but it becomes dehumanized when it becomes mass marketed. And this is the result, where you have simulacra, you simulated people selling simulated products that you cook in simulation machines called microwaves that may or may not bite you. That's all I have for today. I think I'll end with that. Is there any other comments, questions, or ideas you wanted to share? I don't know if you learned anything today, but if I disturbed you, I'll be happy. Dr. Hamilton.
So to take off that last bit there, can you talk about that with the idea of the doppelganger?
Well, sure.
Taking your identity to a computer-generated simulacra.
Droid. Yeah, let me skip ahead to the end of this. Oops. Uh-oh. Beep, beep, beep. There's all sorts of funny noises going on here. I don't know what to do with that. I'm just going to exit this. I'll exit it later. What does that say? Cannot locate the internet. Oh, great. They were listening. They've shut down. Well, clearly it's the doppelganger, or the double is this dead body of this imitation of the original body. Now, it's only creepy, though, if you know Orville Redenbacher, because if you've never seen that before, you just think, oh, that's a bad commercial. They're using bad computer graphics.
Except that this is a trend that is developing now, where Hollywood is talking about, we're going to resurrect dead actors and insert them into new movies using this kind of technology. And in fact, it will look a lot better than that.
Yeah.
Where it will be indistinguishable. What is that going to do to us as consumers of films? When we start seeing people who have been dead for maybe 100 years walking across our film screens.
What will it do to us when reanimated corpses are acting in our films through virtual technology? You have an answer.
Don't you think there's, when I see commercials that are directed toward 70 and 80-year-old women, then they bring out an 18-year-old model. If you use this cream and you're 70 years old, you'll look like this. I mean, that's the same as that.
Well, sure, it's promising eternal life, right? A magical potion that will make you live forever, almost, or at least fool the world into thinking that you're young when you're old, or something. Yeah, it's all about artifice, isn't it? And there's thin line. I was just going to say there's a thin line between art and artifice. And dreams are caught up in this, fantasies, wishes. And the marketplace always promises to fulfill those wishes with its commodities as long as we're willing to buy them. That's kind of the magic system of advertising. But as far as the aesthetics go of movies that feature, actors that are really representations of earlier actors, I don't know what to say about that. I don't know how uncanny it will feel. I don't think it'll work. I don't think people will go to it. I'm not sure. But then again, like in computer games, people buy those like hotcakes, and those all have fake actors and animatrons. Yeah.
And they never ran them again because they got bad feedback.
The Orville Redenbacher is a good example of one. She asked, are there any examples where it just fell flat on people because it might have been too disturbing or just corny? They're all corny, but the Orville Redenbacher one went off the air shortly after it was,
And I'm sure Sam's going to show up and if they track that, they will let them work. But they're just trying always to get the biggest impact or whatever.
Yeah. I should research this. I don't know how they sell Orville Redenbacher popcorn now. I have no idea. It magically pops, I guess. Yeah.
When you use inanimate objects to do the advertising like the M&Ms, they never grow old and die.
Oh, Very astute observation that if you use animatronics, they never die. Yeah, they just keep going and going. Going. Oh, yeah.
Hasn't Woody Allen played with the idea of characters leaping onto the screen and, you know, purple?
Yes, Purple Rose of Cairo.
As we were talking about the film, Bill raised that, there were some other films that I'm just trying to remember what they were, where the actors who've been dead for a long time are brought back into the films. That has been occurring.
Yeah, right. And yeah.
A student wrote a paper for me recently about college students who are paraplegic coming to classes in these exoskeletons, that they're robotic frames that allow them to have mobility. It's kind of interesting. It's tied in with one of your earlier slides with that, you know, what is acceptable.
Oh, the Uncanny Valley.
And I noticed you had in there some robotic hands, robotic bodies.
Yeah.
A student just wrote a research paper on the exoskeleton solution.
Well, the exoskeleton is a solution to paraplegism.
Yeah.
That is pretty amazing stuff. I mean, you know.
Students as opposed to parents.
Yeah, and you know, I bet if you are paraplegic, the first time you feel that movement, it is felt as uncanny, even if it's, you know, healthy, good thing. It probably disturbs you the first time you feel it. Yeah, Dr. Howard?
And that suggests a whole other angle here, where the breakdown between human and machine, like the cyborg is another thing you can put into this, where you're not sure where sort of the human ends and the machine ends.
Okay, we'll add another word to my long, long list, cyborgs. Yeah, I mean, the more you think about it, the more you start to see this everywhere, because we are always pinging the universe for safety and security, for familiarity, and on the lookout for the strange. And the mass market and mass-mediated art is happy to give us the strange all the time. Yeah, go ahead.
An event like that happens in Japanese anime. There's this one show called Ghost in the Shell.
Heard of it, Ghost in the Shell, yes.
There are these extremely advanced cyborgs who have human emotions and the human ability to reason. And that kind of puts it into like this almost fantasy and science fiction realm. Whereas they don't need sleep, they don't need any human needs. They just constantly work to strive for a goal. And that's something that's distinctly human of itself.
It's interesting you explained it as going into more of a science fiction realm. Is it positive? Does it look up? Is it with wonder, or is it dark and negative?
There was one scene where one of them tried to drown themselves.
Oh, they try to drown themselves, okay.
In order to try to understand the concept of death.
Oh, I like that. It's like Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray keeps killing himself over and over again. That's so cool. Yeah.
Isn't there something that Greg, I forgot, you showed me where it's like it becomes sort of human plus?
Well, now you're bringing up the transhuman. That is the fantasy of it. But the argument by these theorists or these computer designers is that they can never get past that valley. That somehow their goal is to get past it. But the second you get past the simulated fake human, you become human again. Right? And that can never really return, ultimately. Now, you're proposing that there might be a transhuman, which is like the android human after all this in the far future. Who's to say? I'm just human, so I wouldn't know. I can't make judgments about that. I'm glad you're believing me that I'm human. That's helpful and reassuring. Right behind you. Nope, you.
Just kind of going off of that, I think like perhaps with better skill at the recreation, it might become less creepy. Just personally, the Orville Redenbacher and Tom Hanks, like, no thank you, I can't stand it.
Yeah.
But then I think about something like the film Scanner Darkly, which was overlaid with animals, but the human was still at its core.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just, there's to me almost a human plus.
Is that, is it rotoscoping? Is that what it's called? Through a scanner darkly, the sort of animation that's based on, it's kind of transposed on top of an actual film footage. And we get that a lot with the green screen stuff where the computer is overlaid on it too. So there is a lot of that kind of digital enhancement to something that was authentically human to begin with, but is transformed into something new. That newness can be felt as strange, always the first time you see it. But the more we get used to it in popular culture, then the more familiar it becomes, the less strange. But you know what? The Hollywood, gaming systems, and all this marketing will fail if it can't keep it strange. So it's in their best interest to keep it in the Uncanny Valley rather than to make it perfect, because then they'll never keep their brand alive. The brand will become an independent automaton that will live on its own and make its own money or something. This stuff is fascinating. I mean, I'd love to talk with you about it forever, but I know it's late, and I'm sure some of you would like to use the restroom. So it's 6 o'clock. Thank you all.